Rain drummed on the roof of the two-story house in the suburbs of Austin when Norman Wilson first felt their future child move under his palm. Casey lay on the sofa, placing his hand on her rounded belly, and smiled that special smile she had had since the beginning of her pregnancy. "Can you feel that?" she whispered. "Our baby is saying hello to Daddy." Norman nodded, but his face remained serious. At 34, he was a man who was used to being in control. 8 years as a foreman at Texas Builders had taught him to plan every step and calculate every detail. The baby was planned, but the reality of pregnancy still frightened him more than he was willing to admit. Casey had been working as a communications operator at Austin Cargo Solutions, a logistics company, for 4 years. The company coordinated freight shipments across the state, and her workday consisted of endless phone calls, tracking routes, and solving problems for drivers stuck somewhere between Houston and Dallas. The work was monotonous but stable, and her insurance covered her pregnancy. In recent months, Norman had noticed that his wife was staying late at work more often than usual. When he asked her why, Casey explained that she was busy. The new cargo tracking system required extra time to learn. Norman frowned, but didn't press the issue. He had enough problems of his own at the construction site. Their marriage lasted 5 years, and the first 3 were truly happy. They met at the Cedar Creek Bar in downtown Austin, where Casey was celebrating her friend's birthday, and Norman was trying to forget another failed relationship. She laughed at his awkward attempts to strike up a conversation, but she gave him her phone number. 6 months later, they moved in together, and a year later, they got married. But the pregnancy changed something in their relationship. Norman became more demanding about the tidiness of the house, what Casey ate, and her daily routine. He bought books on parenting and left them on the kitchen table with bookmarks on the important pages. Casey was annoyed, but she tried not to show it. The atmosphere at Austin Cargo Solutions was more relaxed. The company was located in a small building near the freeway and employed about 20 people. Casey sat in an open office with 3 other operators, their workstations separated only by low partitions. This was where Kevin Marsh had started working 3 months ago. He was 31 years old and had moved to Austin from San Antonio after his divorce, looking for a chance to start over. Kevin got a job as a dispatcher, coordinating long-haul routes. His workstation was directly across from Casey's desk. For the first few weeks, they hardly spoke to each other except on business matters. Kevin seemed reserved and focused on his work. He arrived early, left late, and rarely participated in general conversations during lunch breaks. His colleagues decided that he was just a shy newcomer. Everything changed on the day Casey's computer broke down during an important call with a client. She was trying to explain a new route to the driver, but the screen went blank and all the information was lost. Casey felt tears of frustration rolling down her cheeks. Her pregnancy had made her more emotional than usual. Kevin silently got up from his seat, walked over to her desk, and restored the system in a few minutes. It turned out he was quite knowledgeable about computers, a skill he had acquired over years of working for various logistics companies. "Thank you," Casey whispered, wiping her eyes. "I don't know what I would have done without your help." Kevin smiled slightly, for the first time since joining the company. "It's okay. It happens to everyone." From that day on, they began to talk more. First about work, then about life in Austin, about their favorite places in the city. Kevin turned out to be a good listener, and Casey found herself telling him things she hadn't even shared with Norman. At home, however, the atmosphere was becoming increasingly tense. Norman read articles about the effects of stress on fetal development and constantly reminded his wife of the need to think about the baby. He made a list of foods she should eat and a schedule of walks she should take. Casey felt like she was in a prison of concern. One evening, when Casey came home from work half an hour later than usual, Norman met her in the hallway with a displeased look on his face. "Where were you?" he asked, without waiting for her to get undressed. "At work. We had a problem with a shipment to Houston, so I had to stay late." "In your condition, You can't overexert yourself. The baby needs rest. Casey felt irritation boiling up inside her, but she said nothing. She went into the kitchen and started making dinner, while Norman sat down at the table with another book about pregnancy. At work, Kevin noticed her depressed mood and cautiously asked if everything was okay. Casey told him about her husband's constant monitoring, and Kevin listened attentively, offering no advice, just letting her talk. "He's probably just worried," Kevin said at the end. "Men sometimes don't know how else to show they care." His understanding and sensitivity contrasted with Norman's directive approach. Casey found herself thinking about Kevin even at home, comparing his gentleness with her husband's harshness. It was a surprisingly warm February morning in Austin. Casey sat in her car in the parking lot near the Austin Cargo Solutions office and was in no hurry to get out. She was 7 months pregnant, and every movement was becoming more difficult for her. But it wasn't just physical discomfort. In recent weeks, work had become the only place where she felt free. Kevin was already sitting at his desk in the office, reviewing the trucker's routes. When he saw Casey, he looked up and smiled, the same gentle smile that had been making her heart beat faster lately. "Good morning," he said as she walked past his desk. "How are you feeling?" "Fine, thanks," Casey replied, settling into her seat. She noticed a cup of coffee from the nearby coffee shop on her desk. Decaf, as she liked during her pregnancy. "That's for you," Kevin said, seeing her surprised look. "I noticed you often don't have time for breakfast." Little things like this happened more and more often. Sometimes he would bring her favorite donuts from a nearby bakery. Sometimes he would help her with heavy boxes of documents, and sometimes he would just ask how her day was going. Kevin's attention was radically different from Norman's care. It was unobtrusive and demanded nothing in return. Their work conversations gradually became more personal. During lunch breaks, when the rest of their colleagues went about their business, they stayed in the office and chatted about all sorts of things. Kevin talked about his divorce. It turned out that his ex-wife had left him for his best friend, and this had undermined his faith in relationships. Casey shared her feelings about her impending motherhood and her fears about giving birth. "Norman has already bought half the baby store," she laughed one day, showing a photo of the nursery. A crib, a stroller, a car seat, educational toys. The baby isn't even born yet, and he already has everything in the world. "Is that what you want?" Kevin asked cautiously. Casey thought about it. The question was simple, but the answer was more complicated than she expected. "I don't know. I used to think so. But now sometimes I feel like Norman is planning not only the baby's life, but mine too. It's as if I've become an incubator for his dreams of a family." Kevin listened attentively, without interrupting. This was something she sorely missed at home. The opportunity to speak her mind without immediate advice and instructions. Things were indeed getting worse at home. Norman had turned preparing for the baby's arrival into a military operation. He had drawn up a plan of action in case of premature labor, studied the routes to the 3 nearest hospitals, and insisted that Casey always keep a bag packed in case of an emergency trip to the maternity ward. "You have to think about safety," he would say when Casey complained about the excessive preparation. "I can't let anything happen to you or the baby." His concern was sincere, but overwhelming. Norman controlled her every meal, checked to see if she was taking her vitamins, and timed her walks. When Casey tried to protest, he reminded her of the statistics on pregnancy complications and the need to be responsible. Casey's only salvation was the hours she spent at work, especially the moments alone with Kevin. Their conversations became more and more candid, and their glances more and more lingering. Casey knew something was wrong, but she couldn't stop. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday in early March. Casey stayed late at the office to finish a report on a problematic delivery, and Kevin stayed to help her with a computer program. The other employees had already gone home, and the office was quiet. "Thanks for staying," Casey said when they finished. "Without you, I would have been here until morning." "You're welcome," Kevin replied. but he didn't move away from her desk. A silence filled with unspoken words hung between them. Casey felt his hand on her shoulder and didn't pull away. The next moment, they were kissing, cautiously, gently, as if afraid of scaring the moment away. "This isn't right," Casey whispered, but she didn't pull away. "I know," Kevin replied, "but I can't pretend I don't feel anything anymore." From that day on, their relationship changed. They didn't plan anything serious, just stolen moments of intimacy in the empty office, long glances across their desks, text messages with cautious confessions. Casey knew she was playing with fire, but for the first time in months, she felt alive. Norman didn't suspect anything yet, but his behavior was becoming increasingly paranoid for other reasons. He began to complain that Casey had become distracted and had her head in the clouds. When she forgot to buy groceries from his list or was late taking her vitamins, he would throw a real tantrum. "You have a huge responsibility," he would say after another argument. "The baby depends on you. I don't understand why you can't focus on the things that really matter." For Norman, the important things were exclusively pregnancy and preparation for childbirth. He lost interest in her work, her mood, her thoughts, if they did not concern the future child. Casey felt like a creature reduced to a single biological function. In mid-March, it was time for another scheduled ultrasound. Norman insisted that they go together. He hadn't missed a single doctor's appointment since the beginning of the pregnancy. At Austin Women's Health, they sat in line, and Norman nervously leafed through a brochure about fetal development. "I hope everything is okay," he muttered. Last time, the doctor said the heartbeat was too fast. "That's normal for this stage," Casey explained patiently for the umpteenth time. Dr. Susan Lynn, their attending physician, was a middle-aged woman with a kind face and endless patience. She knew about Norman's personality and always explained each procedure in detail. "Today we will be able to determine the sex of the baby," she said, preparing the ultrasound machine. "Would you like to know?" Norman squeezed Casey's hand. "Of course we would," he replied for both of them. A blurry black and white image appeared on the screen. Dr. Lynn moved the sensor over Casey's belly, explaining what they were seeing: the head, arms, legs. The baby was moving actively, and its movements were clearly visible on the monitor. "So," said the doctor, looking closely at the image, "congratulations, you're having a girl." Casey smiled, imagining a little daughter with dark hair and serious eyes. A girl, that was wonderful. But she felt Norman's body tense beside her. "A girl?" he asked. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely," Dr. Lynn confirmed. "See these lines? These are characteristic signs of female reproductive organs." On the way home, Norman was silent. Casey tried to start a conversation about names for the girl, about how they would redecorate the nursery, but he responded in monosyllables. Only when they parked near the house did he finally speak. "I thought it would be a boy," he said quietly. "I thought you didn't care," Casey replied. "The main thing is that the baby is healthy." Norman looked at her as if she had said something inappropriate. "Of course, health is the main thing. But a boy, it's easier with a boy. I know how to raise a boy." His voice betrayed a disappointment he was trying to hide. Casey felt a pang of resentment for her unborn daughter. "Girls aren't worse than boys," she said more sharply than she had intended. "I didn't say that," Norman snapped. "I just had certain plans." This conversation marked the beginning of a new wave of tension in their home. Norman tried to hide his disappointment, but it was evident in everything he did, in how he stopped enthusiastically discussing names, in how he put off buying certain baby items, in how he avoided talking about their daughter's future. At work, Casey told Kevin about the ultrasound results. He was genuinely happy. "A girl is wonderful," he said. "She'll be as beautiful as her mother." These words warmed Casey's heart more than her husband's reserved reaction. With Kevin, she could be herself, not an incubator for other people's expectations, but simply a woman who was expecting a child and was happy about it. Their secret meetings became more frequent. They found excuses to stay after work, met during their lunch break in a small cafe on the other side of town, and exchanged tender messages throughout the day. Casey knew she was in deep trouble, but she couldn't stop. At home, Norman was getting gloomier. He still cared for Casey, but there was a hint of annoyance in his care. It was as if she had let him down by not living up to his expectations. The baby wasn't even born yet, and Norman already felt betrayed. It was a muggy April evening. Casey sat in her car in the parking lot of the Barton Creek Shopping Center, waiting for Kevin. They had agreed to meet after work. Norman thought she was at the doctor's office, and her boss thought she had already gone home. She was 8 months pregnant, and each meeting was becoming more difficult for her, but her need to see Kevin was stronger than her physical discomfort. Kevin showed up 10 minutes later and parked next to her car. They moved to his car, an old Honda that didn't attract attention. The interior smelled of air freshener and the faint scent of his cologne. "How are things at home?" he asked, taking her hand. "Norman has become even stranger," Casey replied, leaning back in her seat. "Yesterday he spent an hour explaining to me how to breathe properly during contractions. An hour, Kevin. And the day before yesterday, he made a scene because I ate ice cream. He says it has too much sugar." Kevin silently stroked her hand. Over the months of their intimacy, he had learned to just listen without trying to solve her problems. That was exactly what Casey needed, understanding without judgment. "Sometimes I feel like he sees me not as a wife, but as an incubator with legs," she continued. "All the talk is about the baby, the birth, plans for the future, and I've disappeared as a person." "You haven't disappeared," Kevin said quietly. "He just doesn't know how to see you." Those words brought tears to Casey's eyes. Pregnancy hormones were making her more emotional, but that wasn't the only reason. For the first time in months, someone had said what she desperately wanted to hear. They sat in the car for another half hour, holding hands and talking quietly. Kevin told her about his plans. He was thinking of moving to Dallas, where one of his old friends had offered him a job at a larger logistics company. Casey listened with a heavy heart, realizing that their relationship had reached an impasse anyway. That evening, Casey came home later than usual. Norman was sitting in the kitchen with his phone in his hand and a grim expression on his face. "Where were you?" he asked, without looking up from the screen. "At the doctor's. I told you this morning. I called the clinic. Dr. Lin said you didn't show up today." Casey felt the blood drain from her face. She had forgotten that she had lied about the doctor's appointment, choosing it as the safest cover. Her thoughts were jumbled, and she couldn't come up with a plausible explanation. I went to the pharmacy to get some vitamins," she mumbled. "And then I stopped by Jenny's office. She's having problems with her husband." Norman slowly raised his head and looked at her. There was a cold fury in his eyes that Casey had never seen before. "You're lying," he said quietly. "I'm not lying. I just got confused." "Don't lie to me!" Norman suddenly exploded, jumping up from his chair. "I'm not an idiot, Casey. Do you think I haven't noticed how you've changed over the last few months? Always staying late at work, secret phone calls, that stupid smile when you read your messages." Casey backed away toward the door, instinctively protecting her stomach with her hands. She had never seen her husband like this before, his face red with rage, his hands clenched into fists. "Norman, calm down. Think about the baby." "The baby?" He laughed, but it sounded terrifying. "Did you think about the baby when you were having an affair with someone?" "Yes, I know. Do you think I'm blind?" Casey felt her legs buckle. Somehow he had found out. Maybe he had seen them in the cafe, or maybe he had just guessed from indirect clues. Now it didn't matter. "Who is he?" Norman asked quietly, coming closer. "Norman, please." "Who?" he roared, pounding his fist on the table. Casey flinched and began to cry. Her whole world was falling apart before her eyes. Months of lies, stolen moments of happiness, the illusion that she could somehow fix everything. all of it shattered by one simple word. Who? Kevin, she whispered. Kevin Marsh, from my office. Norman froze as if he had been slapped. He knew that name. Casey had sometimes mentioned a colleague who helped her with computer problems. Everything fell into place. The delays at work, the change in mood, the secrecy. How long? He asked in a hoarse voice. It started in March, after the ultrasound. Norman, I didn't plan to. After we found out about our daughter, he stated. So you didn't like my reaction, and you decided to find comfort elsewhere. That's not it. It's not about the baby. Then what is it? Norman sat back down in his chair, and all the anger seemed to drain out of him, leaving only exhaustion. Explain it to me, Casey. Explain what you were missing. Casey frantically wiped away her tears, trying to find the words. You stopped seeing me as a person, she said finally. For the last few months, I've been nothing more than your pregnant wife. Not Casey, just the carrier of your future child. You make my schedule, control every bite I eat, tell me what to think and how to behave. With Kevin, I could just be myself. Norman was silent for a long time, digesting what she had said. I cared about you, he said at last. About both of you. Maybe too much, but out of love. It wasn't caring. It was control. And cheating was love? Casey didn't know how to respond. Her relationship with Kevin was more complicated than simple cheating, but it couldn't be called love either. Rather, it was a refuge from the loneliness she felt in her own home. The next few days passed in painful silence. Norman went to sleep in the guest room and hardly spoke to his wife. He still cooked her meals, bought the necessary things for the baby, took her to doctor's appointments, but he did it all silently, as if he were fulfilling his duties. Casey tried to talk to him several times, but he responded with monosyllables and walked away. She understood that she had hurt him, but she didn't know how to fix it. And the worst thing was, she wasn't sure she wanted to fix it. At work, her colleagues began to notice changes in Casey's behavior. She was distracted, often cried for no apparent reason, and hardly spoke to Kevin. Kevin tried to approach her several times, but Casey asked him to leave her alone. He knows, she finally told him. Norman knows everything. Kevin turned pale. What happens now? I don't know, but we have to stop this. They no longer met after work, didn't exchange messages, and tried not to even look at each other. But the tension between them was palpable, and the other employees began to suspect something. At home, the atmosphere became even more difficult. Norman became a ghost of his former self. He fulfilled all his duties as a husband and future father, but he was emotionally absent. Sometimes Casey caught his gaze, full of pain and rage at the same time. The birth was approaching. Less than a month remained until the due date. At her next appointment, Dr. Lin noticed that Casey's blood pressure was high and asked her about stress in her life. Casey lied, saying that everything was fine. Norman sat silently beside her, but she could feel his tension. You need to get more rest, said the doctor. Stress can trigger premature labor. Is it possible to take time off work early? I'll think about it, Casey replied, even though she knew that sitting at home with Norman in his current state would be even worse. In the car after the appointment, Norman finally spoke. Will you leave me for him after the baby is born? The question caught Casey off guard. She hadn't thought that far ahead, focusing instead on just getting through each day. I don't know, she replied honestly. The baby needs a father. She'll have a father. You. Will I? Norman looked at her bitterly. After everything that's happened, you want us to stay a family? Casey felt her hands begin to shake. For the first time in days of silence, they were talking about the future, and that future looked bleak. I want my daughter to grow up in love, she said. And right now, there is no love in our home. There is only pain and anger. You brought her there. I know, and I regret it. Norman stopped the car abruptly at the side of the road. His shoulders were shaking, and Casey realized he was crying. In all their years of marriage, she had only seen him cry a few times. "I had such a good future planned for us," he said through his tears. "A house, a family, children. I thought we wanted the same things. We did, but you started planning my life instead of living it with me." "And what about him? Didn't he plan? Did he just take what he wanted?" Casey didn't know how to respond. Her relationship with Kevin had been impulsive, spontaneous, the complete opposite of her carefully planned life with Norman. And perhaps that was what attracted them to each other. The remaining weeks before the birth dragged on painfully slowly. Norman reverted to his old behavior, caring but controlling. Only now his concern was laced with distrust and pain. He checked her phone when he thought she wasn't looking. He called her work under various pretexts to make sure she was really there. He studied her face, looking for signs of lies in every word. Casey felt like a prisoner in her own home. She understood that she deserved her husband's distrust, but living under constant surveillance was unbearable. Her only comfort was the movement of the baby in her belly, a reminder that soon there would be a little person for whom she would have to find a solution. At night, lying in her empty bed, Casey thought about the future. She could try to repair her marriage, but she knew Norman would never fully forgive her. Trust had been destroyed, and its shards wounded them both every day. She could leave, but then her daughter would grow up in a broken family. And somewhere deep down, she still thought about Kevin and the moments of happiness he had given her. It was selfish and wrong, but she couldn't just turn off her feelings. Norman didn't sleep at night either. Casey heard him walking around the house, turning on the TV, fussing in the kitchen. Sometimes she heard muffled sounds, either sobs or angry whispers. He was also tormented, trying to figure out what to do next. The contractions started at 2:30 in the morning on April 27th. Casey woke up with a sharp pain in her lower abdomen, and at first thought it was another practice contraction. They had been happening more and more often in recent days. But the pain did not go away. On the contrary, it intensified. Norman was sleeping in the guest room, as he had been for the past 2 weeks since their conversation. Casey got out of bed, holding her lower back, and felt warm liquid running down her legs. Her water had broken. She looked at the clock. The labor had started a week early. "Norman!" she called, trying not to panic. "Norman, wake up!" He appeared in the bedroom doorway a few seconds later, already wide awake. Years of working as a foreman had trained him to wake up at the slightest sound. "What's wrong?" "It started. My water broke." Norman was instantly transformed. All the coldness of the last few days disappeared, and he became the caring husband he had been before their crisis. He helped Casey get dressed, picked up the bag he had packed for the hospital, and checked her documents. "Does it hurt?" he asked, helping her down the stairs. "It's bearable. So far, it's bearable." In the car, Casey clutched the armrest during her contractions. They came every 7 minutes and lasted about a minute. Norman drove carefully but quickly, glancing at his wife and timing the contractions with a stopwatch. "Austin General Hospital?" he asked, even though he knew the answer. They had chosen this hospital a month ago. "Yes, and call Dr. Lin on the way." The drive to the hospital took 20 minutes. During that time, Casey had 3 contractions, each stronger than the last. Norman parked at the entrance to the emergency room and helped his wife out of the car. In the reception area, the nurse on duty immediately assessed the situation and called for a stretcher. Casey was transferred to it, and Norman walked beside her, holding her hand. For the first time in weeks, there was no tension between them, only a shared goal of bringing the baby to a safe delivery. Dr. Lin arrived half an hour later. By that time, Casey was already lying in the delivery room, hooked up to monitors. The contractions had intensified and were coming every 4 minutes. "You're only 3 centimeters dilated," the doctor said after examining her. "It will be a few more hours before you give birth. How are you feeling?" "It hurts, but I'm okay," Casey replied. Norman sat next to the bed and held his wife's hand. There was concern in his eyes, but not the paranoid concern of the last few months, rather sincere concern. "Everything will be fine," he whispered during the contractions. "You're doing great. Just a little longer." At 6 in the morning, she was already 5 centimeters dilated. Casey asked for an epidural. The pain had become too intense. The anesthesiologist gave her the injection, and half an hour later she was feeling better. Norman went out into the hallway to call work and tell them he wouldn't be able to come in. He was standing by the window at the end of the hallway, talking to the shift foreman, when he saw a familiar figure in the hospital lobby. Kevin Marsh was climbing the stairs to the 2nd floor, where the maternity ward was located. He was carrying a small bouquet of flowers and a bag with what looked like baby clothes. Norman felt the familiar rage rising in his chest. He quickly ended the conversation and headed for the elevators to intercept Kevin. "What are you doing here?" Norman asked, blocking his way in the hallway. Kevin stopped. He looked confused and a little scared. I came to see Casey. My colleagues told me she went into labor. My wife went into labor," Norman emphasized. "And I don't remember inviting my wife's lovers." Kevin's face turned red. "Listen, I understand you're angry, but—" "You don't understand anything," Norman interrupted him. "You destroyed my family. At a time when my wife should have been preparing for the birth of her child, you dragged her into bed. That's not true. We never slept together." Norman smirked. "Does that change anything? You stole her heart, and I'm supposed to be happy that I didn't steal her body?" Kevin tried to walk past him. "I just want to make sure she's okay. Give me 5 minutes." "No. Norman, be reasonable." "Reasonable?" Norman's voice rose, attracting the attention of the medical staff. "I've been reasonable for months. I put up with her lies, her absence, her indifference, and now that my child is being born, you come here with flowers?" A nurse approached them. "Gentlemen, please keep it down. This is a hospital." "It's okay," Kevin said. "I'm leaving." But Norman grabbed him by the shoulder. "No, you're not leaving. You're going to go in there and tell her to her face that it's over, that you're not going to ruin her life with your visits anymore. Let me go. First, you'll talk to her." Kevin tried to break free, but Norman held him tight. He was stronger. Years of physical labor had taken their toll. "All right," Kevin gave in. "But just for a minute." They walked to Casey's room. Norman opened the door and practically pushed Kevin inside. Casey was lying on the bed with her eyes closed, resting between contractions. When she saw Kevin, her eyes opened wide in surprise. "Kevin, what are you doing here?" "I came to see you. I heard you were in labor." Casey looked at her husband standing in the doorway with a stony face. "Norman, please." "Tell him," Norman said quietly. "Tell him it's over between you two." A heavy silence hung in the room. Casey looked at Kevin with pain in her eyes. "Kevin, we really need to stop this. I'm having a daughter. I have to think about her." "I understand," Kevin said. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay." "I'm fine." Kevin placed the flowers on the nightstand next to the bed and headed for the door. As he passed Norman, he stopped. "Take care of her," he said quietly. "She deserves to be happy." Those words were the last straw. Norman spun around and punched Kevin in the face. Kevin flew back against the wall, hitting his head on the edge of the medical cabinet. "Norman, stop it!" Casey screamed, trying to get out of bed. But Norman didn't hear her. Months of pent-up rage, pain, and humiliation burst forth. He pinned Kevin down, who tried to defend himself, but was weaker and didn't expect the attack. "You think you have the right to give me advice?" Norman shouted, landing blow after blow. "You ruined my life." Casey tried to get up to stop the fight, but at that moment another fight began, stronger than all the previous ones. She screamed in pain and fell back onto the bed. Norman turned at her scream. There was horror in her eyes, not from the fight, but from what her husband had become. At that moment, something in him finally snapped. He saw the medical scissors on the nearby table. Without thinking, he grabbed them and turned to Casey. "This is all because of you," he said, approaching the bed. "You destroyed our family." Casey realized what was happening a second before the blow. She raised her arms to defend herself, but it was too late. Norman stabbed her 3 times, in the chest, in the neck, in the heart. Casey gasped for air, but blood came out of her throat. She looked at her husband in surprise, as if she didn't understand what he was doing. "Norman, our daughter," she gasped. Those words stopped him. He looked at the bloody scissors in his hands, then at his dying wife, then at Kevin, who was lying unconscious against the wall. The monitors near the bed began to beep, indicating the critical condition of the fetus. The baby's heartbeat slowed along with its mother's. Medical staff rushed into the room, drawn by the screams and sounds of fighting. The first to enter was the same nurse who had asked them to be quiet. Seeing the scene in the room, she screamed, "Code Red! Code Red in room 308!" The hospital exploded with activity. The doctors tried to save Casey, but it was too late. She died 4 minutes after the attack, never regaining consciousness. They tried to save the baby with an emergency C-section, but the girl only lived for 18 minutes. Norman stood against the wall, still holding the bloody scissors, watching the commotion of the medics. Hospital security was already on its way, and someone from the staff had called the police. "Sir, drop your weapon," the security guard said, approaching cautiously. Norman looked at the scissors in his hands as if he were seeing them for the first time. Then he unclenched his fingers, and they fell to the floor with a clatter. Detective Lisa Rodriguez received a call at 7:30 in the morning, just as she was about to take her 7-year-old son to school. The dispatcher reported a double homicide at the hospital. Such cases were rare in Austin. Lisa quickly arranged for her mother to take her grandson to school and drove to the scene. In her 12 years with the Major Crimes Division, she had seen a lot, but family tragedies always affected her more than other cases. Perhaps it was because, after her divorce, she had raised her son alone and knew how fragile family happiness could be. Austin General Hospital was cordoned off by police. Officer James Patrick met the detective at the entrance to the maternity ward with a preliminary report. 34-year-old Norman Wilson had killed his pregnant wife, Casey, in the delivery room with a pair of medical scissors. Kevin Marsh, 31, a colleague of the victim, was also injured and was in intensive care with a concussion. Delivery room number 308 looked like a battlefield. Blood on the floor, overturned furniture, scattered medical instruments. Forensic experts were already at work, photographing every detail and collecting evidence. Lisa carefully studied the crime scene, trying to reconstruct the sequence of events. Dr. Lynn, Casey's attending physician, told the detective what had happened before the tragedy. The delivery had gone smoothly, and her husband had been by her side, acting caring. Then an unfamiliar man appeared in the hospital, and he and Norman got into an argument in the hallway. The doctor admitted that in 30 years of practice, she had never seen anything like it. The nurses confirmed that they first heard raised voices in the hallway, then the sounds of a fight coming from the room, and a woman screaming. When the medical staff rushed into the room, Casey was already bleeding profusely, and Norman was standing nearby with bloody scissors in his hands. Norman was in a hospital isolation room under police guard. When Lisa came to see him, he was sitting on the bed, staring blankly at the wall. His hands were shaking, and there were bloodstains on his clothes. There was no anger or remorse in his eyes, only emptiness. After showing her badge, the detective began the interrogation. Norman slowly raised his head and immediately confessed to the murder of his wife. His story was disjointed but consistent. 3 months ago, he learned of Casey's affair with a colleague named Kevin. At first, his wife lied about her whereabouts, then confessed herself. Norman recounted in a monotone voice how labor began and they went to the hospital. Everything was going well until Kevin showed up with flowers in his hands. The man came to visit Casey on the day Norman's daughter was due to be born. It seemed like an unbearable humiliation to him. The suspect described how he asked his wife's lover to leave, but he refused, citing his desire to visit Casey. Norman forced him into the ward, where Casey told Kevin that it was over between them. But before leaving, he said that Norman should take care of his wife because she deserved happiness. Those words were the last straw. Norman hit Kevin, and a fight broke out. After that, his memory was fragmented. Casey's screams, medical scissors in his hands, blood. He claimed that he did not plan the murder, but simply exploded from pent-up emotions. After questioning Norman, Lisa went to the intensive care unit to see Kevin. He regained consciousness only at lunchtime and was able to speak despite the bandage on his head. The man explained that he had come to see Casey even though he knew what he was doing was wrong. Kevin gave a detailed account of his relationship with Mrs. Wilson. They met at work in January as colleagues and then became friends. In March, they became close, but they never slept together. They only kissed a few times. They mainly talked about Casey's problems at home, where her husband was becoming increasingly controlling. According to Kevin, Norman was aggressive from the start at the hospital. He grabbed him by the shoulder and forced him into the room, where he asked Casey to publicly end their relationship. She did so. Before leaving, Kevin told Norman to take care of his wife, after which Norman hit him. Kevin had a vague memory of what happened next due to his head injury. By evening, Lisa had gathered enough information to understand the full picture of what had happened. She interviewed all the medical staff, Casey's colleagues from the logistics company, and the Wilson family's neighbors. All the testimonies confirmed the same story: infidelity, jealousy, and pent-up tension that exploded at the most inopportune moment. Austin Cargo Solutions employees admitted that they had noticed changes in Casey and Kevin's behavior in recent months, but no one suspected a serious relationship between them. Company manager Jennifer Stone recalled seeing them together in a cafe once, but thought it was a work meeting. Casey had always been a responsible and punctual employee, and her absent-mindedness in recent months was attributed to her pregnancy. Neighbors described Norman as a quiet, polite man who never caused any trouble. Only Mrs. Johnson, who lived nearby, recalled one argument she heard through the wall in early April. Norman was shouting and Casey was crying, but that was the only incident of its kind. The psychological profile compiled by the department's expert indicated a crime committed in a state of affect. The stress, feelings of betrayal and humiliation that had built up over months exploded at a critical moment when control over emotions was completely lost. Norman's formal arrest took place the next day. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Casey and his newborn daughter. Court-appointed attorney Robert Chen immediately announced his intention to plead temporary insanity, arguing that his client was in a state of extreme emotional distress. Travis County District Attorney Michael O'Connor took a tough stance, telling reporters that family problems could not justify the murder of a pregnant woman in a hospital. Such a heinous crime requires the most severe punishment, he emphasized. Kevin spent 3 more days in the hospital with a diagnosis of concussion and facial contusions. After being discharged, he submitted his resignation and left Austin a week later. In his final interview with Detective Rodriguez, he admitted that he felt guilty about what had happened every second. If he hadn't come to the hospital, Casey and her daughter would still be alive. The man understood that he couldn't have foreseen such a violent reaction, but he blamed himself for his selfishness. He knew about Norman's rage and his broken marriage, but he came to the hospital anyway, guided by his own desires rather than common sense. The trial took place 8 months later. The jury deliberated for 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Judge Margaret Fisher sentenced Norman to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, noting that his actions had taken the lives of 2 innocent people at a time when the miracle of birth should have been taking place. Norman listened to the sentence without emotion. During his months in prison, he had lost a lot of weight and aged considerably. In his final statement, he asked Casey's relatives for forgiveness, but did not explain his motives in more detail. Lisa closed the case in December, 8 months after the tragedy. Her official report read, "Murder motivated by family jealousy. Motive established. Suspect arrested and convicted. Case closed." But for the detective herself, the case was not so easily closed. Every time she drove past Austin General Hospital, she thought about how quickly a human life could be destroyed. 3 people made a series of wrong choices that led to a tragedy that could have been avoided with more wisdom and restraint. Casey's family, her parents and younger sister, moved away from Austin 6 months after the trial, unable to bear the constant reminders of the tragedy. The Wilson family home was sold to pay off the mortgage. The Austin Cargo Solutions office moved to another building because employees couldn't work properly in the place where it all began. The Wilson family's story became a cautionary tale of how jealousy, mistrust, and an inability to communicate healthily can completely destroy human lives.